All right. Yeah. All right. Welcome in, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. We got a small group, but hope to have a good little session here. So this is part two of this series that I've put together on the question of independent parties or third parties in the U.S., especially on the U.S. left. Um, so let's see. So to go over what the big picture here, because I know not everyone was here last time, which is fine. There's a recording of that you can check out or just look at the slides. But so that first part was talking about generally like what we even mean by political parties and particularly how they are structured in the US and how that differs from some other places and how that creates particular obstacles for socialists and for the left in trying to engage in electoral politics. Um, this part two, which is what we are doing right now, is going to be more case studies of people who have tried to overcome the problems of, on the one hand, the Democrats suck, and it sucks to have to try to work with them and within them, but also there are lots of structural and political impediments to building an alternative to them. And people who have tried to do this in various ways, and we're going to talk about sort of the successes and failures of five that I've selected because I think they make useful points. If there's other ones we want to talk about or ask about, we can get to that. This is just sort of based on both what people expressed interest in and also what I thought was important. And we'll get to what those are in a minute. And then next week, the next session, the last sort of formal session is going to be taking us, part of the idea for me doing this is taking us up into us as DSA organizers, and in particular, the last decade of what I call modern DSA, meaning after the big post 2016 membership explosion, when our electoral strategy changed, we started electing a lot of people to office. Um, and a lot of these sort of the things I talked about last week and then I'm talking about this week will feed into what's going to cover actually getting into the nuts and bolts of what are the debates people are actually having now and have been having for the last decade about what DSA should do in regards to these questions. And then that sets up a fourth. This is going to be like an in-person thing, an open discussion, political discussion where people can come and bring their own perspectives and their own thoughts about all of this stuff. So moving on with it, we begin with part two. So do the community agreements. I think we all everyone who's here basically knows the basics of the Mid-Hudson Valley community agreements, progressive step up, step back, why am I talking, I statements, one speaker, one mic, listening and versus waiting to talk, asking questions, assume best intentions but challenge, learn by making mistakes. And my addition to that, just for these sessions in particular, is like speak up and ask questions if something doesn't make sense. You can stop me in the middle, or you can wait till the end to bring stuff up. But the premise of this session, and of all these sessions, is that a lot of talk about independent parties or the Democrats isn't well grounded in what these terms mean, what they sort of mean historically, what they mean politically, and so I'm trying to like contribute to addressing that in some way. So, what I'm going to talk about today, in general overview, first of all, is just thinking if we're thinking about trying to do some third party or quasi third party alternative to the Democrats. What are the different strategic reasons to do that? Because there are different ones and they all have their merits. And why you're doing it obviously matters a lot for how you're going to set things up. Second is going to be how we're going to be talking about in some of these examples is how does a third party get around the structural barriers to electoral success in the US system in particular. And we're going to go through some prior examples of these third parties and how they worked out, illustrating some points. So just to go quickly over what I talked about last time, which was like a month ago, but again, it is recorded. We all know the Democrats aren't a workers' party. As that they're both it's a capitalist party, just not quite as insane as the Republican Party. As Tanzanian African socialist Julius Nyerere once famously said, the U.S. is too. When he was accused of running a one-party state in Tanzania, he said, "Well, the United States is a one-party state as well, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them." Uh, so not only are they not a workers' party, they aren't, as I discussed in the last session, really a party at all in the sense of being a membership organization in which leaders are accountable to members. Like there isn't like a membership of the Democrats in the sense of like rank and file members who vote for their leaders the way we in DSA say vote for convention delegates who elect our national political committee or how we elect the steering committee of our chapter. The Democrats are a much more diffuse collection of funders and donors and NGOs and unions and the elected officials themselves and consultants and whatnot. But U.S. election law also, as we went over, makes it very difficult for third parties to break in. Like since the late end of the 19th century, which is the period I'm going to be talking about, there's been a sort of the two-party duopoly has been enshrined in laws in ways that give Democrats and Republicans big advantages and make it hard for third parties to break in. Hard to get access to the ballot, hard to keep ballot access if you get your own ballot line, all of that stuff. Which is why third parties were more common in the 19th century before the system fully became established, which is not the a period I'm going to get into when like you even had full realignments of the party system where, the Republicans arose because the old Whigs collapsed before the Civil War and so on. And those are interesting things to consider as well for what they might make possible for the future, but it's going to be beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk about. So, all of this being the backstory, what are some historical examples we can talk about? And I'm going to start with the big one that I'll probably spend the most time on, which is, well, wait, before I get to that, never mind. I want to talk about, I said I was going to talk about why, setting this up with uh, why do we run candidates, right? And it's because it's not always just to win. I mean, I think in DSA, especially in recent years, there's been a big focus on, we don't just do this for the symbolism of it or as a protest vote. We want to run candidates because we think we can win. But that's one reason, obviously, to win power directly, which means you get your people in office, and ideally they are elected officials who, unlike most Democrats, are actually answerable directly to a Democratic organization and are organized into, like, we have our Socialists in Office Committee in New York State and so on. So that's sort of been the thrust of a lot of DSA electoral work in recent years. You can also, though, win power indirectly, even if you don't get into office yourself. Like you can get candidates to adopt some of your demands by threatening them with primary runs and things like that. You can kind of gain positions within a coalition, get your priorities looked at more, get, appointed to things and so on. So that's another reason to run even in elections you're not necessarily going to win or you think you don't have a great chance to win. And then thirdly, there's just the campaign as a propaganda platform, which is what a lot of left formations have done. Which is basically recognizing this is particularly the case at like the federal level or in other big elections, where if you're a kind of a small organization and a left organization that the media is not very friendly to, running candidates can be a great way to get free media. Even if you may not be intending to win, you may not even have a strategy as an organization that thinks that elections are the road to power, right? If you're a revolutionary socialist organization that doesn't even believe that, but you still run in elections because they serve as this valuable propaganda platform. And we'll see elements of all of these things in the examples that I'm going to go through. So here are the case studies. First and biggest one that we have to talk about because it looms large in American history and for DSA is the Socialist Party, particularly the Socialist Party in its heyday of the early 20th century. And the theme that I want to get at there is how really at their height they combined elements of what I was just talking about, both the sort of propaganda campaign and also the winning power at a local level and participating in local governance in a way that we didn't see again socialists doing until just a little bit now with DSA, basically. Then I'm going to talk about the Green Party, which, for me at least, my generation, I feel like is the quintessential kind of like third party protest vote party, particularly at the federal level. They're the go-to for like you're just fed up with the Democrats and Republicans, and they provide something else. But there are great limits to that strategy, which we're going to get into because it is so focused both on the protest vote aspect of it and on this sort of top-down running people at a federal level aspect of it over the kind of local work. Then I'm going to get into the Minnesota Farmer Labor Party, which is a little bit of a more historically obscure one, but it's relevant not just because I'm from Minnesota, although I do enjoy that part of it, but because it plays into some DSA debates that are going to come up in the next session about how DSA should relate to the Democrats and the idea of the dirty break, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Fourth, I'm going to talk about an attempt to sort of do some type of soft break or dirty break with the Democrats, which was the Labor Party. Now, there have been many things called Labor Party in the United States history. The one I'm talking about was started in the 90s and kind of petered out about, a decade later. And we'll talk about what that was and sort of why its strategy ultimately was not a success. And then finally, we'll talk about something close to home that actually does still exist, which is the Working Families Party. which some people have asked about. And obviously, we get questions all the time about how they differ, for example, from DSA. And I want to go into a little of the backstory, just partly because I think it's fun that most people don't know about. It's the Working Families Party, which is now a national organization. For a while, was basically a New York State only organization, but comes out of another national project called the New Party in the 1990s, um, which was organized around fusion voting as a solution to the problem of the ballot line, which I'll get into in that section. All right, so starting with the Socialist Party, here we have our lovely Eugene V. Debs, longtime leader, most famous member probably of the Socialist Party, repeated candidate for president. Socialist Party founded in 1901 or thereabouts. There's sort of various kind of organizations that lead up to its founding, but basically turn of the century, the Socialist Party is founded. Merger between the Social Democratic Party, which was Debs's faction, and a faction of the Socialist Labor Party. The Socialist Labor Party is kind of the original Socialist Party in the U.S. That was formed in the late 1800s, but it had a much more sort of syndicalist focus, meaning focused much more on building radical organized labor and even building like radical alternative unions to like the AFO unions at the time. And it was also pretty like sort of purist and sectarian in its kind of orthodox form of Marxism, and so it never grew that big, but it did produce some of the people that went into forming the Socialist Party, which was going to be a broader, kind of looser, bigger tent, more similar to what DSA is um, than what the SLP had been. Now, interestingly, and I put this as an aside that just to show how broad the conception of even what a party can be is, as I said in the last section, it doesn't even have to involve electoral politics, I think, to be considered a political party. I think we should broaden our sense of what is political. And the Debs faction of the Socialist Party originally had a non-electoral focus. There were a lot of people who thought that the objective should be the first step should be what they called in their dated language of the time a colonization strategy, which meant forming like a model collective socialist, cooperative. They wanted to do it in Tennessee, I think, to sort of show that socialism would work. And it was only after that argument was defeated that people said, no, we should be running in elections and trying to win power that way. Um, so in terms of size and power, like by some, this is most people would say, by the way most people would define a socialist organization, this is the biggest socialist organization that we ever had by membership, at least. Their peak was about 113,000 members in 1912, which if you adjust for like the population of the U.S. would be like if you had like 400,000 members today. So like, nothing has come close to that since, and DSA is about the closest we've gotten. And of course, we are, at least in population adjusted terms, still much smaller than they were. In terms of their electoral success, they had quite a bit of it, more than most of the others we're going to talk about here. Eugene Debs won over 900,000 votes for president a couple of times in 1912, which, as we saw, was sort of their peak, and again in 1920 when he was actually in prison and ran from prison, where he'd been put for opposing the draft for World War I. So he got 6% of the vote in 1912, 3.4% in 1920, which is, it's sizable, obviously, more than a socialist has won for president since, or vast majority of third-party candidates who have run for president, but still a relatively small part of the vote. But at the same time that this was happening, they were also electing mayors, council members, all kinds of other officials in like 300 cities around the country. So they had there was the local angle to the Socialist Party was just as important as the thing that maybe they're most remembered for now, which is Debs getting all these votes for president, running for prison, all of that stuff. Then the sort of later point, the decline of the Socialist Party, basically, their peak was in the 1912 and that era. They decline. First, there's the 1917 Red Scare around World War I, the passage of the Espionage Act, which was used to put Debs in jail for opposing the draft. And also you have the Russian Revolution, which leads to a lot of sort of debates and splits, and the rise of the Communist Party, which also ran candidates. I'm not going to get into them because I didn't feel it was super significant, but for the record, not that it's not super significant, but it doesn't illustrate a key point that I needed to make. But we can talk about them later if you want. But most the CPUSA ever got when they ran someone in elections was William Z. Foster's 100,000 votes, or 0.3% in 1932. And yeah, Daniel mentioned that they had 10 or 11 socialist state legislators in Albany. And in fact, part of the decline of the Socialist Party and the Red Scare repression was 5 of them were expelled from the New York State Assembly in 1920 for being socialists, basically. Um, and the Socialist Party did continue on after this sort of high point. It didn't finally, but it changed its name in the early 70s. And there's actually, you can trace back a sort of lineage of DSA to the Socialist Party through people like Michael Harrington, who came out of the Socialist Party, split with them when the right wing of the Socialist Party supported the Vietnam War, and went on to found the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which merged with another organization to form DSA in the early 80s. But in any case, if you like that kind of like drawing the family trees kind of stuff, you can take DSA all the way back to the Socialist Party of Debs. So here just gives you more of a graphical idea of what we're talking about here. These were the Socialist Party's office holders. And so the peak year that if you can see on the graph where they had like 150 plus was in 1911, almost as many in 1912. So these like the green are legislators, I think the red are mayors, and then the pink color is like other elected officials of various kinds. And you can see it's a pretty like just a big bump, and then it just kind of there's a brief resurgence, somewhat of a resurgence in the 30s. This was the Norman Thomas era of the Socialist Party. But it never got it back to the heights that it reached here. And if you want more of this kind of stuff, the data about membership and vote totals and all that stuff, this website at the University of Washington, the Mapping American Social Movements Project, is great. They've dug up all kinds of great info. Here's just one more graph from that, giving you a sense of where the Socialist Party was. So these the size of the dots are coded to how many members it was, and then the color of the states shows you proportional to like the population of that state, how many Socialist Party members there were. So um, as today, many socialists in New York State, it was the biggest numerically, but actually proportional to population. I mean, obviously most of the population was in the eastern U.S. at that time, but the West was where they were quite strong. Of course, there was a lot of labor radicalism out west. The Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, were big out there. Minnesota coming up big again, very strong. The European immigrant workers in like the logging and mining regions of the Iron Range in northern Minnesota were important to the socialist and communist movements of the time. Um, and not too bad in Indiana, which did I mention is the birthplace of Eugene Debs himself, who was a Union Railroad organizer before he became a socialist leader. So probably I'd say the most the most important socialist to come out of Indiana, but prior, of course, to Pete Kavanaugh. Yeah, so this is the sort of rise and fall. This was where what the Socialist Party amounted to sort of at its peak. And what I want to talk about in sort of getting off this case and getting to the next one is not so much the like all the whys and wherefores of the decline, because it's a lot of things, and a lot of it is specific to the period, some of it isn't. What I think that is noteworthy about what the SP did and what they was that it sort of combined two elements of the kind of reasons for doing electoral politics that I was talking about at the outset. So you had the national like presidential campaign, like Debs running for president, which, again, we saw he never got more than like 5% or so of the vote. He was never going to be elected president, but the Socialist Party is remembered now and attracted attention then because of those campaigns. And you may have noticed I gave you his totals for 1912 and 1920. He did not run for president in 1916. They ran somebody else who was not nearly as well known or as good of a speaker, and they got a lot less votes. So there was that value. However, that wasn't the only thing that they were doing. The other side of their electoral work was all those local elected officials that we just saw in the graph, and that was where you got the sort of what's sometimes referred to now as sewer socialism. If you've ever heard the term sewer socialism, it comes out of this period of the SP and particularly in Wisconsin, where they had a very strong socialist party, and in Milwaukee, where they controlled the government for a good period of time. And the term came about because basically someone quipped that these are the people who, they weren't talking to you about revolution or socialist theory or Karl Marx. They wanted to tell you how great they were at running the Milwaukee sewer system. And that the model here was that you sort of win people over to socialism by showing them, like almost going back to the original colonization model of building a test case. We can show them that we can run a city for the working class, and do it competently, do it better for people than the capitalist class. And so, the socialists controlled the Milwaukee City Council by 1910, and they had the last socialist mayor of Milwaukee, Frank Zeidler, was in office until 1960, at a point when the Socialist Party itself was almost dead and was not really running candidates at all anymore in most places. Um, Sorry. So that to me is the sort of the thing. There's lots. I mean, we could spend hours talking about the Socialist Party, and there's so much. It's such a big and complicated historical moment. But that's the thing I wanted to sort of emphasize, is that it really had both of those things. It had the big flashy campaign that attracted a lot of attention nationwide, and it had the sewer socialists who were exercising power at a local level. So now we take it to something completely different, the Green Party. And the Green Party to me is an example of what happens when you have the sort of the one part of what the Socialist Party had, the sort of presidential level federal campaign that attracts media attention, but you don't have the other part. So the Greens started in the 1980s. They were formalized into a party in the 90s, and they kind of coincided with Green parties and green organizations coming about in a lot of countries, especially rich countries, with the rise of the environmental movement. So you'll see there are green parties in many countries, like that are kin with, but are not like formally related to the U.S. Green Party. They all just sort of came out of the same movement, but they had quite different fortunes, and a lot of this has to do with the very specific structural features that I talked about in the previous session about what makes it so hard for third parties in the U.S. So if you take Germany, for example, which had a very successful Green Party, these days its politics are terrible. It became very kind of pro-war and reactionary. But the Greens in Germany did become a viable third party because the system of parliamentary representation in Germany is proportional, meaning that parties get seats in parliament relative to their share of the vote. So if you get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats, basically. And that allows minor parties to get into government in a way that is just not, in general, possible here. So as a result, the Greens have mostly focused on their protest campaigns, and mostly focused on it at the national level. Um, I'll note here that there's other parties I could get into that sort of do a similar thing, including like socialist organizations. So like people who just run third-party candidates for president as sort of propaganda platforms and protest campaigns. Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL, does this. The Communist Party used to, continue to run candidates that were mainly for propaganda purposes. But in those cases, it's part of a bigger sort of party building strategy. Like the PSL wants to recruit people into a revolutionary Leninist organization, and one of the ways they do that is by the platform of the campaign. The Greens really, I mean, they have historically been just extremely electoral focused. Like that's what they do, that's what they are. But what I'm coming to with that is what has been the result of it. There have been, in total, since the 90s when they started running candidates, 8 Greens have held state level office, like anywhere ever. And most of those are weird cases where someone like left the Democrats so that they could get on a different ballot line and get elected, and then they went back to the Democrats. Like these were not people who were like loyal kind of, cadre of the Greens. These were just weird circumstances where a third party ballot line got somebody elected. So mostly what they're known for is their presidential campaigns. And if we look at those, you get their first one in 1996. Ralph Nader, the famous consumer advocate, runs with Winona LaDuke, an indigenous activist. They get 600 some thousand votes, 0.7%. Probably their most famous election, certainly if you're my age, is the 2000 election, which was my first election as an adult. And Nader and LaDuke ran again, and they got 2.7% of the vote, which is pretty good for a left third party. But of course, 2000 was the election in which the election came down to the Florida recount, and the Supreme Court essentially stole the election and gave it to Bush, even though he had not won. And because it was such a close election that led to all of that chaos, there's a certain type of liberal who to this day will complain about how Ralph Nader is personally responsible for the George W. Bush administration. But this indicates a problem with this strategy, which is it does leave you open to those kinds of accusations, and it makes it hard to pitch yourself to people who are like, well, I'd like to support you, but also I don't want the Republicans to get in. And then also what happened is that as they continued to run presidential candidates, and they just didn't get a lot of traction. So they ran someone else named David Cobb in 2004. Nader himself ran again, but he was on a different ballot line this time, the Reform Party, which was Ross Perot's old party. And this is indicative of something about the Greens too, is that they never, I think also in part because they were so focused on ballot access and federal level campaigns, there was not a lot, and sort of the celebrity nature of someone like Ralph Nader as the figurehead, they were never able to build durable organization or sort of build on the big vote totals that they were able to get in these elections. So like there was this drop off in 2004. Cynthia McKinney ran in 2008, while Nader again ran as an independent, splitting the third party vote, as it were. And then Jill Stein, who has been their presidential candidate for several election cycles now, ran in 2012, again 2016. Howie Hawkins ran in 2020. Jill Stein again 2024. This still gets a certain amount of attention simply because the nature of the U.S. system is that the there people are just get fed up and they want something else to vote for. But as I sort of talked about a bit in the previous session about American electoral rules, so much energy in terms of time, money, lawyers, everything goes into just like trying to get on the ballot and stay on the ballot that there's sort of almost no time for anything else. And, as Seth Ackerman points out in his article that I talked about last week, and we'll talk about again next week about party surrogate strategy, the Greens and parties like them tend to attract people that are really just into this sort of symbolic victory of getting a third party on the ballot rather than having that be part of a larger strategy. So this is sort of my case study of what happens when you have a third party that can do the big celebrity headline presidential candidate but can't really do much else. All right. Third case study, the Farmer Labor Party of Minnesota. So this is perhaps the most obscure one, but because it will become relevant to some DSA debates, I wanted to talk a bit about what it was. Founded in 1918, and it comes out of some other kind of third-party stuff that was going on at the time, somewhat of the stuff that succeeded the Socialist Party after their heyday in various places. It had strong support both from some socialists and from organized labor. The labor movement was quite strong in Minnesota at that time. This is quite important to their ability to do what they did. Now, in terms of what their strategy was, this is where they're useful as a case study because they're a little bit different than anything we've seen so far. So we had the Socialist Party where they're just running socialists on the socialist ballot line as a third party against Republicans and Democrats. And then you have what DSA does, which is mostly run in Democratic primaries, unless it's in a situation where it makes sense to not do that. But mostly we run in Democratic primaries, and then do not run on third-party ballot lines in general elections. This party kind of started out sort of like the DSA strategy, except they started out as something called the Working People's Nonpartisan League, which comes out of the Nonpartisan League movement, which was a thing that was happening. It was like a farmers movement as well as an industrial workers movement that was running, as the name suggests, they were nonpartisan in the sense that they were not running as Republicans or as Democrats. So what they would do is they would run people in the Republican primary, they would run people in the Democratic primary who had sort of pledged themselves to support the platform of the Working People's Nonpartisan League. But then if they lost the primaries, they did not promise to support the eventual nominee, and they would still run people as third-party candidates in the general election. Now, what happened to them is that this strategy worked pretty well for a while and they were building power. But in another important theme, I think, of some of these case studies, the thing about electoral strategy is that if you're too successful with it, the establishment can change the rules. And this is what happened to them, which is that basically the Minnesota made it illegal for for candidates who lost in a primary to then run in the general election. So the whole strategy of we can run in the primary, but then if we lose, we can still run against you in the general, it's no longer possible. So you have to choose sort of in or out. Either keep running in Democratic or Republican primaries, and then sort of you can then no longer contest in the general, or you become a fully independent party, which is ultimately what they did. And they again, they had support from organized labor, although it took some time to get buy-in to this idea of mounting a fully independent party. And they had a pretty, strong internal structure to both have the resources and the sort of internal discipline to run their own candidates. And they were successful. They actually did elect people to office. They elected a couple of senators and a congressman in 1922. They elected the governor in 1930. They were a powerful force in Minnesota politics. Um, Now, the end of them, the reason you don't know about them today is because they eventually merged back into the Democratic Party. And again, the reasons for that are complex. Some have to do with the Cold War. They kind of purged the left out when they merged them back in. Um, I'm not going to really get into that. I do just like the curiosity, however, that if you look today at Minnesota, Minnesota does not have just a party called the Democrats. It has a party called the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. That is what the Democrats are called in Minnesota, and this is the reason for that, is because of this entire history of these people who ran in Democratic primaries and then left and formed a separate party and then eventually merged back in. So, why bother revisiting all of this? A DSA specific reason is because they gave rise to one of a theme of debate over electoral strategy in DSA and what's referred to as the dirty break. This is meant to be in contrast with a clean break. So a clean break would be basically just like we all say, okay, we're not running in Democratic primaries. We're going to set up our own party with our own ballot line, our own candidates, be totally and fully independent third party, sort of like the Greens try to do, like the Socialist Party was in its heyday. The dirty break is comes out of an article by Eric Blanc in Jacobin in 2017 about the Farmer Labor Party, where he describes what happened to them as the dirty break, meaning that they started out more like DSA as people who were using the party primary system in order to run their candidates, but then ultimately they were able to then transition from that into being fully independent. And so that has been held out as a model for how DSA should think about what we're doing. And we have seen in past conventions, and we will see it again at this convention, I'm sure, debate over whether this is the correct strategy, and if so, what it would actually take to make it a reality, to set up all of the structures to have a party that, to basically do all the things that an independent party needs to do in terms of its infrastructure and its funding and all of that type of stuff. And so, yeah, there's the article. And yeah, he argues that using the major party ballot lines doesn't preclude eventually forming an independent party. That's the important part, is that it's not a matter of either we're permanently running in Democratic primaries or we just immediately start a third party. That the Farmer Labor Party gives this sort of alternative way of thinking about it. And yeah, because it's relevant to the recent DSA debates, I'm going to come back to this stuff in the next session, which is going to be all about that. So I will leave this part here for now in order to move on. Second to last. So fourth case study, the Labor Party. This particular Labor Party that this button is from their founding convention in 1996. So 1996, it's the labor movement is in decline in the US as it had been for years and would continue to be for years after that. The Democrats under Bill Clinton have become much more anti-labor. This is when the real neoliberal turn happens in the Democrats. So there's a lot of disfaction among labor people and union leaders. And so a bunch of them, led by a guy named Tony Mazzocchi, fascinating character, read about him. He was the leader of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union. He was kind of the mastermind of this idea of forming a labor party, basically saying, rather than being this sort of disrespected junior partners of the Democrats, we need to figure out how to form a labor party. And, as I talked about a bit in the Farmer Labor Party example, you need to get buy-in, like from organized labor in a big way, like from actual major unions if you want to do something like this. And at least on paper, this is what happened. In their founding convention, they had 9 different international unions, plus 117 various local and state unions who endorsed them and sent people to their founding convention and all of this. Now, and those unions, again, on paper represented about 500,000 workers. So like you have the makings of it seems like what should be, this might have some legs, right? However, they never actually ran independent candidates as the Labor Party, even though that was their ostensibly their long-term objective. And Mazzocchi died, and things kind of faded out, and they ceased operation in 2007. So what went wrong with the Labor Party? There's a couple of links that'll be in the presentation that you can look at later. Mark Dudzik was a major figure in the Labor Party. he and his co-author did a sort of a post-mortem, and he also did an interview for Jacobin talking about what happened. And there's a couple of things. One of which is just the continued decline of the labor movement. Things union density continued to decline. Things were, if anything, worse. I mean, union density has continued to decline since then. I would say there's at least some there's some stirrings of at least, movement in new areas like, Amazon and Starbucks and higher education. At this time, everything was, industrial unions were going downhill and nothing was really coming to replace them for the most part. That's part of it. Although, of course, this poses the question about the Labor Party, which is it that there would have needed to be more of a revival of the labor movement in order to make this project feasible? Or is it in fact the opposite, that an actual labor party is what would have been necessary to prevent the continued decline of the labor movement? So there's a sort of chicken and the egg question here. But this is all held back by the other major problem, which is sort of another theme we've seen for, which is this problem of being called a spoiler or of being seen to have, help Republicans and anti-labor candidates win in the same way that the Greens are routinely accused of doing. So I'm just going to read a long extract from Dudzik and Isaac's account of this because they sort of describe exactly what happened here. They said an organizing dynamic took hold in which enthusiasm for developing an alternative to the Democrats peaked in the off-cycle election years and then diminished as the unions mobilized for yet another round of elections, which sure sound familiar from the way things work today. And say this dynamic cannot solely be attributed to muddled, compromised, or timid union leadership. Unions and working people in general have real concrete interests and concerns which must be defended in the electoral arena, even as we work to transcend the boundaries set by the two parties of the bosses. So the prospect of breaking completely with the Democratic Party without an established alternative was too risky for even the most militant unions, and it remains the biggest challenge to any effort to build an independent labor politics. This, I think, is the thing that, you will hear talk, and I certainly agree in the abstract with the idea that the labor movement would have to be the basis of any viable socialist third party or independent left third party. At the same time, we do have to recognize what Dudzik and Isaac are saying here, which is that unions, it's not just about having sort of bad leadership, although that happens, obviously. It's that unions are complex entities which are trying to look out for the immediate interests of their members, as well as to hopefully build an environment that is better for unions, better for workers in the long run and overall. And that can make it difficult to get them on board with the kind of electoral project that involves breaking with the Democrats because of this dynamic. All right, so continuing one last go around, my final case study, yet another way to deal with this question of the ballot line and the spoiler and how do we build independently of the Democrats is the Working Families Party, which will be probably the most familiar to all of you, although maybe you don't know all of this backstory. The main story that I want to talk about here is this new approach to the ballot line problem that's different than any of the ones that we've talked about so far, which is what's called fusion. Fusion voting means, well, since we're in New York, you will have a sense of what it means because you've experienced it, which is running the same candidate on multiple ballot lines. So if you go on election day in the general election, then you see the same candidate's name on the Democratic ballot line and the Working Families Party ballot line, and you can vote for them on either one, and those vote codes get added together. So so you can cross endorse candidates with multiple party lines in a general election. So you're not dealing with just the primary situation, but you're also not running necessarily an oppositional third candidate. So advantages of this, of using fusion voting, one, alleviates this spoiler issue. It allows you to, try to find people, you can sort of pick out, if there are good Democrats that you want to support, you can cross endorse them without being committed to, running a third party that's likely to lose and that can be accused of being a spoiler. However, while doing that, you clearly are signaling to the candidates which party their vote, which part of their vote came from your. Sorry, that's misspelled. But which part of their vote came from your ballot line. So it's very helpful in sort of like documenting to someone. It's like if you won with 20% Working Families votes and 80% Democratic votes, then you can say, okay, this was the chunk of your margin of victory that we gave you, and therefore you owe us in some sense. The other advantage of it, in theory, is that it still leaves open the possibility that when circumstances are right, you can run a third party candidate just by yourself on your own line. You still have a ballot line in the general election, and you can choose to either cross endorse someone who has like the Democratic nomination or go it alone if you feel like they're terrible and you need to run someone against them. So it's more flexible, at least in theory. So this leads to the creation of what was called the New Party, which you know, was again, it's the same period when the people who founded the Labor Party were coming together. Some different people were trying to deal with the Democrats sucking in a different way with this project called the New Party, who I think I encountered at one of my first ever political demonstrations against Newt Gingrich's contract with America in 1994. But anyway, it was founded by a former Jesse Jackson staffer named Dan Cantor, so like a political operative, and an academic named Joel Rogers, and other people, but they were the key figures in it. And they built in their time successful chapters in several states. So it was a nationwide project that was meant to have a new party model based on the idea of fusion voting. And they even experimented with something, this is something similar to what the nonpartisan league people in the Farmer Labor Party era did. They even experimented with like contracts, sign contract with the candidates so that they would say, you can have our ballot line if you commit to X, Y, and Z, so that it would be more credible and that it would actually represent something and that you could actually build power through the ballot line in that way. However, the reason they no longer exist is because basically they lost a Supreme Court case over a Minnesota law. So again, Minnesota changing the rules comes up again. This time, Minnesota banned fusion voting because again, if you're too successful, the major parties will change the rules. They tried to get the Supreme Court to rule that that fusion was a voting right, basically, and lost that case. And as a result, almost nowhere has fusion voting now. Only Connecticut and New York use full fusion voting of the kind that we're talking about, which is why, though this system is quite familiar to us if we're involved in electoral politics in New York, it's basically unheard of everywhere else. So what happened as soon as the New Party fell apart, Dan Cantor, the co-founder of the New Party, helped found the Working Families Party. Because fusion was still legal in New York, and so the strategy could still be deployed there if it couldn't be deployed anywhere else. And so I think of the Working Families Party as the sort of like remnant of the New Party. And so that's for that reason it was originally a New York-based organization. But then it itself then in recent years has gone on to become an organization with chapters in many states. However, because fusion is not an available strategy in other states other than Connecticut, it has had to basically become a different type of organization. Basically, I would call it a sort of a progressive nonprofit that engages in electoral politics in different ways depending on local conditions. So, an example, sort of an interesting example of this, is their role in Philadelphia. So, in Philadelphia, there are a couple of people who've been elected to the city council as working families candidates, just working families only, not as Democrats, because there's no fusion there. But the reason for this is because in Philadelphia, there are two seats that are reserved for the minority parties on the city council, which doesn't specify. Historically, that was Republicans, of course. It's an overwhelmingly Democratic city, so the two reserved seats would go to Republicans. But it doesn't specify that. It just specifies minority party. And so the Working Families Party was able to take advantage of this and elect people to those seats that were set aside for the minority party. So that's just totally different strategy than the New York strategy. It's just based on what are the local conditions in terms of what's legal and what's possible electorally. So, closing us off with sort of what are some of the limitations that we see with fusion as a strategy as it's was historically deployed by the New Party and then has been by the Working Families Party. It's still oriented around a ballot line. There are, as I said, there are all these kind of like the ballot line is being fundamentally a thing managed by the state, and to get access to it and to keep it, you have to jump through a lot of hoops, and it takes up a lot of your time and energy. And as we saw, the establishment will change the rules to keep you out. And this has happened. We still have fusion in New York, but it's become, Andrew Cuomo made various attempts over the years to weaken it or destroy it because he hates the Working Families Party, and wanted to destroy it. The irony of that is that ballot access, because in New York, it requires you to get a certain number of votes to get the threshold to keep the ballot line, and that can force you into making some decisions you don't want to make, such as endorsing Andrew Cuomo for governor, which the Working Families Party did a number of times, which was a matter of great debate. Um, but there were a couple things in play. One of which was this need to get a certain number of votes because the rule is in New York you have to get a certain number of votes on your ballot line for governor specifically in order to keep your position on the ballot. Um, and so the argument was made, I think falsely, but was made that basically the Working Families Party would lose their ballot access if they didn't endorse Cuomo in those elections. The other piece of it, though, is similar to the issue we saw in the Labor Party, which is that the big backers historically of the Working Families Party were major unions in New York who were, as we see today in the New York City mayor's race, they took the cautious position of like going with power essentially to protect the short-term interests of their members, and so they pushed for things like backing Cuomo when the more radical activist base of the Working Families Party was opposed to it. Um, Another problem that emerges is that because you have this state-managed ballot line that you have to control and have to deal with, that you don't have full control over who runs on your ballot line. This people can, as quote unquote, steal the ballot line because there are primaries. There are ways anybody in theory can run to get the Working Families ballot line, and if you're not on top of it, some rando ends up on there or a Republican or who knows what, which has happened. I mean, it happens, and it's just a cost of doing business. So yeah, and as I said, it's in practice there were similar problems to the Labor Party, and that major financial backers who were the unions didn't want to break with the Democrats. Eventually, in 2018, the Working Families Party did endorse Cynthia Nixon, and then this led to a bunch of unions basically breaking with the Working Families Party because this was the sort of the contradiction. And then the party ended up anyway pulling Nixon off the ballot in the general election so that she would not be quote unquote a spoiler against Cuomo. So that's okay. That's not a little longer than I wanted, but not too bad. So those are my five case studies, and I'm just going to I want to leave this part here with some what I thought of as some takeaways from looking at these examples and what we can sort of think about for our own strategy. So the Socialist Party, I think, shows you that symbolic campaigns, the kinds of like protest vote or sort of like media propaganda strategy campaign where you're not going to win can exist alongside winning concrete power. It's difficult to hold together. There's a lot of contradictions in it, but it's very powerful when it works. And at the height of the Socialist Party, it did work. You had sewer socialism and sort of celebrity candidate socialism happening at the same time. And we have these kinds of debates now around like the fact that once you didn't have Bernie Sanders running anymore, there was nothing sort of at the top of the ticket to like create the galvanizing force and attract attention that would allow organizations like DSA to build. And the question is, what replaces that? Um, Another takeaway that comes up in multiple of these examples is that the support of organized labor appears as both a necessity and an obstacle for these projects because of the conflicting interests of the unions themselves, right? Like, if you want the people and the resources to make this stuff a reality, you need labor. But the actually existing labor movement can be a very cautious and conservative force. And again, that's not just due to bad leadership, but due to the nature of what unions are and what they have to do as institutions that look out for the interests of their members in the short term and not just the strategy of the working class in the long term. And then finally, we've seen various different ways of dealing with the question of the ballot and the question of what party line to run on. And in the end, unfortunately, there is no electoral or ballot line magic bullet that can overcome, a lack of financial support, a lack of a mass base, or, too much establishment opposition. Like so various of these things, I think we can learn things from all these examples, and they all had greater or lesser degrees of success in their time. But yeah, unfortunately, this stuff is just hard, which is why we're going to move on in next week's session onto how all of this figures into DSA electoral strategy, specifically after 2016, because lots of other people were thinking and talking about these questions. And part of my objective in running this series is to make sure our members, many of whom have joined recently or just have not been up on all these debates, to make sure that we can all know some of our own history about the debates that have been had and are still being had about our own electoral strategy. So we'll talk about a little bit about what pre-2016 DSA electoral strategy was like, going back to the late 70s and the concept of Democratic Party realignment, which you still hear thrown around as a pejorative, usually I think referring to things that are not realignment, but we'll get into that. We'll talk about the Bernie 2016 campaign, how that led to our explosion in membership and the rise of the party surrogate model, partly taking off of Seth Ackerman's essay that I discussed last week, of building a party without focusing on the problem of maintaining your own ballot line. And then I want to actually talk about like some of the internal politics of DSA that we don't always necessarily talk about outside of our caucuses if we're in one. So that again, we can be up on what the actual debates are, especially as we go into another national convention. So we'll talk about stuff like the party surrogate, the dirty break, the dirty stay, the prime voter trap. If you don't know what any of that stuff is, great. Come next week and we'll talk about what they all are. Um, but for now, yeah, I'm just gonna leave it off there. I've been talking for a good long time. Um, I'm gonna, where's my, sorry, there we go. Stopping the share. I will stop the recording here and just, well, open it up. Let me take a quick look at some of lots going on in the chat. Which, great, yes, Kirsten Cinema used to be a Green. True. That is a good example of how the Greens attracted all kinds of people for all kinds of reasons, and they never built sort of an enduring organization that could make people accountable to them. Um, yeah, Amanda, talking about Oberlin College in 2000. Yeah, I was in at the University of Chicago, and I was also in the national leadership of the youth section of DSA, as YDSA was called back then. And yeah, the Nader versus Gore debate kind of tore us apart. And yeah, Daniel's saying Green Party had a New Paltz mayor who officiated gay marriages before they were legal in New York. That is definitely the thing they're probably most admired for in New York. And yeah, and that was a cool thing. But as Daniel says, they didn't build any infrastructure after that, which is the story of the Green Party. Successes, breakthroughs occasionally here and there, but um, yeah, no institution building. And yeah, Klaus says fusion was how someone like Fiorello LaGuardia operated in New York City in the New Deal. That is an interesting point, which beyond my scope, but yeah, cool. And then yeah, Daniel talks about Tish James being elected on the Working Families Party line. It's like the only example of the Working Families electing someone without the Democratic line, at least that I'm aware of, in a significant contest anyway. That was a very weird race, as I recall. Like somebody died, somebody was maybe indicted. It was weird circumstances. And of course, Tish went on to run as a Democrat after that. And then says working families thought about running Yulin Yo against Dan Goldman in New York 10 and decided not to, which again sort of points to the limitation that I was talking to you about, which is that, in theory, having the fusion line means you can break off on your own, but in practice, it's very hard to get people on board to do it. Yeah, Daniel says someone was assassinated and then their brother became the Democratic nominee and Tish beat him. Um, and yeah, Klaus says LaGuardia was a Republican who got support across ballot lines for the American Labor Party, which yeah. So yeah, as this suggests, I sort of picked the examples that I picked because I thought that they were illustrative, or in the case of things like the Socialist Party, just incredibly historically important and good predecessors for us. But there's so many different things that you could pick out, and yeah, that's what I got. What are people's thoughts or questions or additional things anyone would like to add? I will just stop recording now.